Hey! What are you doing here?
Afternoon, officer. I'm picking up my mail.
Don't play smart with me. You live here?
Yes, sir. That's my house right there. These are my envelopes, addressed to Damon Brooks.
Put your hands on the car.
Relax. I'm reaching into my inner pocket.
Don't.
This, Special Agent Brooks, DHS. I live here.
The afternoon sun hung low over the rooftops of Westbrook Heights, casting long amber shadows across the manicured lawns and brick-fronted colonial homes that lined Maple Ridge Drive. It was a Thursday in late September, the kind of day when the air carries that first hint of autumn crispness, when leaves are just beginning to turn at their edges but haven't yet surrendered to the season's inevitable pull. The neighborhood was quiet in that particular way that affluent suburbs achieve in the middle of a weekday afternoon. Most residents were at work, children still in school for another hour, and the only sounds were the distant hum of a leaf blower somewhere down the block and the occasional chirp of birds settling into the old oak trees that gave the street its character. This was the kind of neighborhood where people waved to each other from their driveways, where property values climbed steadily year after year, and where the biggest controversy in recent memory had been a heated debate at the Homeowners Association meeting about whether to allow solar panels on street-facing roofs. It was comfortable, predictable, safe in all the ways that word is meant to convey, and in some of the ways it shouldn't. And it was into this placid suburban tableau that two men were about to collide in an encounter that would expose just how fragile the illusion of safety can be for some people, even in their own front yards. Before we go any further into what happened that September afternoon, I want you to do something for me. If you're watching this from anywhere in the world right now, drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from. I'm always amazed by how these stories resonate with people from every corner of the globe. And if you haven't already, consider subscribing to this channel because the story I'm about to tell you contains a twist that I promise you won't see coming. Trust me when I say you'll want to stay until the very end. Now, let me introduce you to the two men at the center of this story. The first is Officer Kevin Hartwell, a 41-year-old patrol officer with the Westbrook Heights Police Department. Hartwell had been with the department for 13 years, long enough to consider himself a veteran of the force, long enough to have settled into patterns of behavior that had become so ingrained he probably didn't even recognize them as choices anymore. He was a broad-shouldered man with a crew cut going gray at the temples and the kind of permanent squint that comes from years of staring at suspects through tinted car windows. His personnel file told a story that should have concerned his superiors more than it apparently did. Over the past decade, Hartwell had accumulated 3 formal warnings for what the department euphemistically called selective enforcement patterns. In plain language, this meant that he had a documented tendency to stop, question, and detain people of color at rates significantly higher than could be explained by any reasonable policing metric. Each time a complaint was filed, there had been meetings. There had been conversations with supervisors. There had been mandatory refresher training on bias recognition and constitutional policing. And each time, Hartwell had nodded along, signed the required forms, and returned to the streets unchanged. His defense was always the same. He was simply doing his job, protecting the community, following his instincts. And his instincts, it seemed, consistently told him that certain people in certain places deserved more scrutiny than others. On this particular Thursday, Officer Hartwell was in his patrol vehicle, a white Ford Explorer with the Westbrook Heights PD logo emblazoned on the doors, rolling slowly through the winding streets of the Maple Ridge subdivision. He had been assigned to what the department called Residential Security Patrol, which essentially meant driving through upscale neighborhoods, maintaining visibility, and responding to any calls that came in. It was a quiet assignment, the kind usually given to officers who were either approaching retirement and wanted an easy ride, or those whose supervisors wanted to keep them away from higher tension situations. Whether Hartwell's assignment here fell into the latter category was never officially stated, but it was quietly understood. The second man in our story is Damon Richardson, and to understand the full weight of what was about to happen, you need to know something about who Damon Richardson actually was. He was 44 years old, a black man of medium height with a close-cropped beard streaked with the first hints of gray. On this afternoon, he was dressed in what he would later describe as his working clothes, a charcoal gray suit, well-tailored and conservative, a light blue dress shirt without a tie, and polished black Oxford shoes. He had just returned home from a meeting at his office and had decided to take advantage of the pleasant weather by walking to his mailbox at the end of his driveway rather than collecting the mail later when he pulled his car in for the night. This seems like such an ordinary detail, doesn't it? A man walking to his own mailbox. But what Damon Richardson was doing at that moment was far less significant than who Damon Richardson was. For the past 16 years, Damon had worked for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Not as an agent in the field, although he had spent his early years in that capacity, but as an instructor at the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia. His specialty? Teaching new agents and law enforcement officers from departments across the country about use of force protocols, de-escalation techniques, and perhaps most relevantly, the recognition and elimination of implicit bias in policing. He had literally written portions of the curriculum used to train federal agents on how to avoid doing exactly what was about to be done to him. Damon had purchased his home on Maple Ridge Drive 4 years earlier. It was a handsome 2-story colonial with burgundy shutters and a wraparound porch that his wife had fallen in love with the moment they pulled up for the first showing. They had raised no objections at the closing, had met no resistance from the homeowners association, had been welcomed by their neighbors with the traditional casseroles and invitations to block parties. The Richardsons were, by every measure, established members of this community. Their children played soccer with the other kids on the street. Damon himself served on the Neighborhood Watch Committee, a detail that would later strike everyone who heard this story as almost unbearably ironic. The body camera mounted on Officer Hartwell's uniform captured everything that followed. Every word, every gesture, every flicker of expression. What it couldn't capture, of course, were the thoughts running through each man's mind. The split-second calculations, the surge of emotions that would define this encounter. But by piecing together the footage, subsequent interviews, and official records, we can reconstruct those invisible elements with reasonable confidence. It began at 3:47 in the afternoon. The timestamp on Hartwell's body camera would later become an important part of the official record. At that moment, Damon Richardson was standing at the end of his driveway, flipping through the small stack of mail he had just retrieved from his mailbox. There were a few bills, a catalog his wife had somehow gotten onto the mailing list for, and a postcard from his daughter's orthodontist reminding them of an upcoming appointment. Normal mail, ordinary life. Officer Hartwell's patrol vehicle had been moving slowly down Maple Ridge Drive from the opposite direction. He had passed several residents during his circuit. A white woman walking a golden retriever, a white teenage boy shooting hoops in his driveway, a white elderly man raking leaves near the sidewalk. The body camera footage would later show that he had not stopped to speak with or even slow down significantly for any of these individuals. They were, apparently, exactly where they belonged. But then he saw Damon Richardson. What happened in Hartwell's mind during those next few seconds is something we can only partially reconstruct. We know that he slowed his vehicle. We know that his eyes fixed on the black man in the nice suit standing at the end of a driveway in this particular neighborhood. We know that some calculation occurred, some mental process that led him to conclude that this situation warranted intervention. What we cannot know with certainty is whether that calculation was fully conscious or whether it bubbled up from somewhere deeper, from a place where years of assumptions and stereotypes had been quietly accumulating. The patrol car came to a stop about 15 feet from where Damon was standing. The engine idled for several seconds before the driver's side door opened. In that brief pause, Damon Richardson looked up from his mail and registered the presence of the police vehicle. He would later describe his initial reaction as mild curiosity. Perhaps there had been an incident in the neighborhood he hadn't heard about. Perhaps the officer needed directions. The possibility that he himself was the subject of the officer's attention didn't immediately occur to him. After all, he was standing on his own property, doing nothing more suspicious than checking his mail. Officer Hartwell stepped out of his vehicle with what the body camera footage shows was a very particular kind of deliberateness. His hand didn't move to his weapon, not yet, but his posture was that of a man approaching a potential threat rather than a fellow community member. His shoulders were set, his stride purposeful, his expression fixed in what could only be described as professional suspicion. Here's the thing that's worth pausing to consider. In that moment, before a single word was exchanged, a judgment had already been rendered. Damon Richardson, FBI instructor, homeowner, husband, father, neighborhood watch committee member, had been looked at and found suspect. Not because of anything he had done, not because of any behavior that would have raised reasonable concern, but simply because he was a black man in a space where someone had decided black men didn't belong. If you've ever experienced this yourself, if you've ever felt the weight of someone's gaze making calculations about your right to occupy your own life, then you know exactly what Damon Richardson felt as Officer Hartwell approached. And if you've never experienced it, I want you to really sit with this moment, to imagine what it would feel like to be scrutinized while standing in your own driveway, collecting your own mail, doing absolutely nothing wrong. Drop a comment below and let me know your thoughts on this. Have you ever been in a situation where you were questioned simply for existing in a certain space? I want to hear your stories. Officer Hartwell's first words, captured with crystal clarity by his body camera, were, "Good afternoon. Can I ask what you're doing in this area?" Damon looked up from his mail, his eyebrows rising slightly at the question. There was a pause of perhaps 2 seconds, during which a lifetime of similar encounters seemed to flash across his expression. This wasn't the first time he had been questioned about his presence in places where he had every right to be. It wasn't even the first time since moving to this neighborhood, but there was something about this particular officer's tone, the proprietary authority in his voice, that struck Damon as particularly pointed. "I live here," Damon said simply. His voice, as captured by the body camera, was calm, even completely neutral. No hostility, no defensiveness, just a statement of fact. He gestured toward the house behind him with the hand holding the mail. "This is my home." Hartwell's eyes moved from Damon to the house and back again. The body camera caught this scan, this assessment. Later, analysis of the footage would show that his gaze lingered on certain details: the expensive suit, the well-maintained property, the luxury sedan visible in the open garage. Something in Hartwell's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. It wasn't acceptance of Damon's explanation. If anything, it seemed like the visible markers of success and belonging made the officer more skeptical rather than less. "You live here," Hartwell repeated, making it sound less like an acknowledgement and more like a challenge. "In this house right here." "That's correct." "And you can verify that somehow?" Damon felt something tighten in his chest, a familiar sensation that he had learned to control through years of training, years of teaching others how to manage their emotional responses in tense situations. Here was a moment that required all of that discipline. He knew exactly what was happening. He had literally taught entire courses on this exact dynamic, on how officers sometimes allow unconscious bias to guide their interactions, on how innocent people can find themselves suddenly cast as suspects based on nothing more than appearance and location. The irony was not lost on him, not even slightly. "Officer," Damon said, his voice remaining steady, "I'm not sure what's prompted this conversation, but I've lived at this address for 4 years. I'm happy to provide identification if you can explain what reasonable suspicion you have that would require me to do so." It was a careful response, deliberately phrased. Damon was drawing on his professional knowledge now, that understanding of constitutional law and police procedure that he had accumulated over nearly 2 decades with the Bureau. He wasn't being confrontational, but he also wasn't simply rolling over. He was creating a record establishing that he knew his rights, signaling to the officer that this wasn't a situation where ignorance could be exploited. Hartwell's jaw tightened visibly on the body camera footage. He wasn't accustomed to this kind of response. In his experience, when he asked questions, people answered them. When he requested identification, it was produced. The calm, measured pushback from this man in the nice suit seemed to irritate him in a way that the footage makes clearly apparent. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in this neighborhood," Hartwell said. "Someone matching your description was seen looking into vehicles on Oakwood Lane earlier today." This was a lie. The subsequent investigation would reveal that there had been no such reports, no calls about suspicious activity anywhere in the Maple Ridge subdivision that day. Oakwood Lane was 3 streets over, and neither the dispatch logs nor the patrol assignments showed any reason for Officer Hartwell to have information about incidents there. It was, as Damon immediately suspected, a fabrication designed to justify an interaction that had no legitimate basis. But here's the thing about being a black man confronted by a police officer in America. even if you know you've done nothing wrong, even if you're standing in your own driveway, even if you're a federal law enforcement instructor who literally teaches courses on exactly this kind of situation, you still have to make calculations that most people never have to consider. How far do you push back? At what point does asserting your rights become dangerous? When does standing on principle risk escalating a situation beyond your control? Damon felt the weight of these calculations pressing down on him even as he processed the officer's obvious fabrication. He thought about his wife, who was inside the house and might look out the window at any moment to see her husband being questioned by police. He thought about his neighbors, who might be watching from behind their curtains, drawing their own conclusions. He thought about the body camera on the officer's chest and whether it was actually recording, whether the footage would ever see the light of day if this situation went badly. And he thought about all the people he had trained, all the lectures he had given about maintaining composure, about not giving officers any excuse to escalate, about the cruel mathematics of survival that people of color in America have been forced to learn. "Officer," Damon said, and his voice remained impossibly calm, "I can assure you I haven't been anywhere near Oakwood Lane today. I've been at work until about 20 minutes ago when I returned home. This is the first time I've stepped outside since pulling into my garage." Hartwell's eyes narrowed. The body camera captured the slight shift in his posture, the way his weight settled more firmly onto his back foot, a subtle positioning that anyone trained in reading body language would recognize as preparation for potential confrontation. "You're saying you can prove that?" "I'm saying I don't believe I'm required to prove my whereabouts to you when I'm standing on my own property and haven't done anything wrong." Damon paused, then added, "But if it helps resolve this, I'm happy to show you my driver's license, which will show this address as my residence." What Damon didn't say, what he deliberately held back, was any mention of his actual profession. It would have been easy to play that card, to invoke the magic words that might have immediately changed the dynamic. But Damon had made a decision, almost unconsciously, that he wanted to see how this played out. He wanted to know what kind of officer he was dealing with. And perhaps more importantly, he wanted to understand in a visceral and personal way what ordinary people without his credentials experienced in these situations. This is the moment where the story begins to pivot, where the dynamic that Hartwell thought he controlled starts to shift beneath his feet. But before we get there, I want to acknowledge something important. What Damon Richardson chose to do in this moment was in its own way a form of research. He was gathering data, observing behavior, testing hypotheses that he had developed over years of studying these encounters from the other side. But it was also incredibly risky because the same credentials that made him an expert on police misconduct offered him no protection against becoming a victim of it. Damon reached slowly toward his inside jacket pocket, making sure his movements were deliberate and visible. This too was training. Never make sudden movements. Always announce what you're doing. Keep your hands visible. The checklist ran through his mind automatically, the same checklist he had taught to countless civilians in community outreach programs. "I'm going to reach into my jacket for my wallet," Damon said clearly. "Is that all right with you?" Hartwell's hand moved slightly toward his belt, not quite to his weapon, but in that direction. "Go ahead." Slowly. Damon produced his wallet and extracted his Virginia driver's license. He held it up, not extending it toward the officer, just displaying it clearly. The address on the license matched the house behind him exactly. There it was, in black and white. Damon Richardson, 847 Maple Ridge Drive, Westbrook Heights, Virginia. Hartwell took the license, studied it for a long moment. The body camera showed his eyes moving from the card to Damon's face and back again. Something was happening behind those eyes, some recalculation. But whatever adjustment was being made, it didn't lead Hartwell to the conclusion that would have been appropriate, an apology and a departure. Instead, he said, "This could be an old license. You could have moved." Damon felt something cold settle into his stomach. This was it then. This wasn't a misunderstanding that could be cleared up with documentation. This was something else entirely. This was an officer who had decided that his instincts were more reliable than evidence, who had locked into a narrative and was now working backward to justify it. "That license was renewed 8 months ago," Damon said. "You can see the issue date right there. I'm going to need to verify this." "Verify it how exactly?" Hartwell didn't answer the question directly. Instead, he turned his attention to the house, that careful, scanning gaze that police officers use when they're assessing a location. "Is anyone else in the residence right now?" "My wife is inside, yes." I'm going to need to speak with her. At this point, I want you to really think about what's happening here. A man has been stopped on his own property. He has provided legal identification that confirms his residence, and the officer, rather than accepting this documentation and moving on, is now requesting to interrogate his wife. This isn't protection. This isn't service. This is harassment wearing a badge. Damon felt the cold sensation in his stomach harden into something else. Not anger exactly, though anger was there too. It was more like a terrible clarity, a recognition that he was witnessing something he had described in lectures dozens of times but had never experienced quite so personally. "Officer," Damon said, "with respect, I don't believe you have any legal basis to question my wife. I've provided you with valid identification. I've answered your questions. If you're not going to charge me with anything, I'd like to end this conversation and go inside my home." Hartwell's face flushed slightly, visible even on the body camera footage. Whatever he had expected from this encounter, it wasn't this kind of composed resistance. In his experience, people became nervous, apologetic, eager to please when confronted by police authority. They didn't calmly cite legal standards. They didn't refuse requests with polite firmness. This was not how this was supposed to go. "Look," Hartwell said, and there was a new edge in his voice now. "I'm trying to do my job here. There's been suspicious activity in this area. You match a description. I'm just trying to verify that everything is on the level." "What description exactly do I match?" The question hung in the air between them. It was, of course, a question that both men already knew the answer to. The description Damon Richardson matched was simple and damning. He was a black man in an affluent white neighborhood. That was the suspicious activity. That was the reason for this encounter. Everything else was pretext. Hartwell's mouth opened, then closed. The body camera caught this moment of hesitation, this instant where the facade slipped just enough to reveal the machinery underneath. How do you answer that question without saying what everyone involved already knows? How do you maintain the fiction of neutral professional policing when the foundation of the encounter is anything but? "A black male," Hartwell finally said. "Medium height, well-dressed." That was the description given. So anyone matching that description in this neighborhood is automatically suspicious? "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to." The conversation had reached an inflection point. Both men could feel it. Something was going to have to give. Either Hartwell would back down, acknowledge that he had made a mistake, and leave, or he would double down, escalate, find some way to assert his authority over this man who refused to be intimidated. In the houses along Maple Ridge Drive, curtains were beginning to move. Neighbors who had noticed the police car parked in front of the Richardson home were starting to pay attention. Mrs. Patricia Coleman, an 82-year-old woman who had lived on the street for over 40 years, was watching from her living room window 2 doors down. George and Maria Santos, a couple in their 60s who lived directly across the street, had both drifted toward their front window. These would become important witnesses later, their observations adding crucial context to what the body camera recorded. What they saw was a standoff. A police officer, hand hovering near his belt, facing a black man in a business suit who stood with a quiet dignity that seemed almost otherworldly given the circumstances. It was the kind of scene that had been repeated countless times across America in front of countless homes, with countless outcomes. But this particular instance was about to take a turn that none of the participants could have predicted. Hartwell made a decision. Later in his official statement, he would describe it as standard procedure and an abundance of caution. But the body camera footage suggests something closer to frustration, a desire to regain control of a situation that was slipping away from him. "Sir, I'm going to need you to put your hands on the hood of my vehicle while I run your identification." Damon's eyebrows rose. "Excuse me. You heard me. Hands on the vehicle. Now." This is what escalation looks like. This is how encounters that should end with a polite apology instead end with handcuffs, or worse. An officer, faced with a citizen who knows his rights and refuses to be bullied, reaches for the tools of physical control rather than accepting that his authority has limits. But what Officer Hartwell didn't know, what he couldn't have known because he had never bothered to ask, was that Damon Richardson had spent 16 years training people to handle exactly this kind of situation. Not from the civilian side, although that training existed too. From the law enforcement side. Damon had taught countless officers how to recognize when they were escalating unnecessarily, how to identify the moments when their own emotions were overriding their judgment, how to step back from confrontations that served no legitimate purpose. And he had also taught courses on documentation, on how body cameras were becoming the most important check on police misconduct, on how footage could save careers or end them, on how every interaction was now potentially recorded for posterity. Damon looked directly at Officer Hartwell's chest, at the small device mounted there with its blinking red light. "I want to make sure I understand," Damon said, his voice clear and projected now, obviously intended for the recording. "You are ordering me, a resident of this address, which I have verified with valid identification, to assume a detention position on your vehicle. Is that correct?" Hartwell hesitated. Something about the way Damon had spoken, the careful enunciation, the direct acknowledgement of the camera seemed to register. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. "I'm asking you to cooperate with a lawful order, and I'm asking you to state for the record what legal basis you have for that order. I have committed no crime. I have provided identification. I am standing on my own property. What is the justification for detaining me?" The question hung in the air. In the houses along Maple Ridge Drive, more curtains were moving now. Phones were being lifted. The digital eyes of the neighborhood were beginning to turn toward this scene on a Thursday afternoon. Hartwell was trapped, and some part of him seemed to recognize it. He had escalated to a position he couldn't justify, and the man in front of him clearly knew it. The body camera was recording everything. If he pushed forward, if he forced the confrontation, he would be creating evidence of his own misconduct. But if he backed down, he would be admitting that this whole encounter had been baseless from the start. It was at this moment that the front door of 847 Maple Ridge Drive opened. Michelle Richardson, Damon's wife of 18 years, stepped out onto the porch. She was still in her work clothes, a professional dress and cardigan, her hair pulled back in the style she wore for her job as a senior administrator at the local hospital. She had been in the kitchen when she heard the voices, had looked out the window to see her husband facing a police officer in their driveway. The sight had sent a cold spike of fear through her chest, the kind of fear that every black wife and mother in America knows intimately. But Michelle Richardson was not the type to cower behind curtains. She walked down the porch steps, her heels clicking against the concrete with deliberate precision. "Is there a problem here, officer?" she asked, and her voice carried the same calm authority that her husband had been maintaining. Hartwell's attention shifted to this new arrival. "Ma'am, please stay back. This is a police matter." "This is my home," Michelle said, coming to stand beside her husband. "And that is my husband. So whatever is happening here is very much my matter as well. I'm verifying your husband's identity and residence. He lives here. We've lived here for 4 years. Our names are on the deed. Our cars are registered here. Our children go to school in this district. What else do you need to know?" There was something about the united front the Richardsons presented that seemed to deflate Hartwell's aggression. Two people now, both calm, both articulate, both clearly refusing to be intimidated, and behind them, the evidence of their belonging. The well-maintained house, the professional attire, the entire tableau of successful suburban life that his original suspicion had been designed to challenge. But before Hartwell could respond, another voice joined the scene. "Excuse me, officer." It was Patricia Coleman, the elderly neighbor from 2 doors down. She had put on a light jacket and was making her way across the lawn toward them, moving with the careful determination of someone who had decided that something needed to be said, regardless of the consequences. "Mrs. Coleman," Damon said, a note of concern in his voice. "You don't need to get involved in this." "Nonsense," Patricia said. She came to a stop a few feet away, looking at Officer Hartwell with an expression that combined curiosity and something harder to define. "Officer, I'm not sure what this is about, but I can tell you that Mr. and Mrs. Richardson have been my neighbors for 4 years. I've been to dinner at their home. Their children have helped me bring in my groceries. If you're questioning whether they belong here, I can assure you personally that they most certainly do." Hartwell's face had gone through several transitions during the past few moments. The body camera captured the shift from authority to uncertainty to something that might have been the beginning of shame, or perhaps just the realization that his actions were now being witnessed by multiple people who could corroborate whatever happened next. "Ma'am, this doesn't concern you." "I rather think it does." I've lived on this street for 43 years. I know who belongs here and who doesn't. And I'm telling you that you're harassing a good man for no reason I can see." Now more neighbors were appearing. George Santos had stepped out onto his front porch across the street. Another family, the Hendersons, had emerged from their house 3 doors down. The scene that had begun as a private encounter between 2 men was rapidly becoming a community event. This is how accountability sometimes works. Not through official channels, not through internal review boards or civilian oversight committees, but through the simple power of witnesses, through the refusal of ordinary people to look away when something wrong is happening in their midst. Let me pause here and ask you something. If you saw a scene like this unfolding in your neighborhood, what would you do? Would you step outside, speak up, make yourself a witness? Or would you stay behind your curtains telling yourself it wasn't your business? There's no judgment in the question. These are genuinely difficult decisions. But I'm curious what you would do. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Officer Hartwell was now facing a situation he had not anticipated. What had begun as a routine assertion of his authority over a suspicious person had transformed into something entirely different. He was surrounded by witnesses, his every word being recorded by his own body camera, and the man he had stopped was showing no signs of the fear or deference that usually made these encounters easy to control. He made his decision. Later, he would describe it as a tactical withdrawal to reassess the situation. Others would call it something less flattering. "Fine," he said, his voice tight with suppressed frustration. He thrust Damon's driver's license back toward him. "We're done here. For now." "No," Damon said, and there was something new in his voice now, a steel that had been hidden beneath the calm. "I don't think we are." He reached into his jacket pocket again, and this time he removed something that changed everything. A leather credential case, which he flipped open to reveal a gold badge and an identification card. The badge caught the afternoon light, gleaming against the dark leather. "My name is Damon Richardson," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the driveway to the neighbors who were watching. "I'm a senior instructor at the FBI Academy in Quantico. For the past 16 years, I have been teaching federal agents and law enforcement officers about use of force protocols and bias recognition. What I just experienced here, Officer Hartwell, is exactly what I train people to avoid doing." The silence that followed was profound. It seemed to spread outward from the driveway, like ripples in a pond, touching each person who had gathered to witness this scene. Patricia Coleman's hand rose to cover her mouth. George Santos took a step backward on his porch, processing what he had just heard. Michelle Richardson, who of course knew exactly who her husband was, allowed herself a small, tight smile. But it was Officer Hartwell's reaction that the body camera captured most vividly. His face went through a rapid series of transformations, confusion, disbelief, then a dawning horror as the full implications of what he had done began to sink in. He had just racially profiled and attempted to detain a federal law enforcement official. Not just any official, but one whose specific expertise was recognizing and documenting exactly the kind of bias he had just displayed. The next few seconds felt like an eternity. Hartwell's mouth opened and closed several times. His hand, which had been hovering near his belt throughout the encounter, dropped limply to his side. All the authority, all the certainty that had defined his posture since he stepped out of his vehicle seemed to drain away, leaving something smaller and more uncertain in its place. I didn't," he stammered. "You didn't what, Officer Hartwell?" Damon asked, and his voice was calm again, almost gentle, like a teacher leading a student toward an uncomfortable truth. "You didn't know who I was. That's exactly the point. You shouldn't need to know that I'm a federal agent to treat me with basic respect. You shouldn't need to know my credentials to accept that a man standing in his own driveway, collecting his own mail, belongs in his own neighborhood." Hartwell's face had gone pale. The body camera showed beads of sweat forming on his forehead, despite the pleasant autumn temperature. "The difference between me and most of the people you stop like this," Damon continued, "is that I have the knowledge and resources to ensure this encounter is documented and addressed. But what about all the others? What about the people who don't know their rights, who are too frightened to push back, who don't have a dozen neighbors willing to step outside and bear witness?" He took a step toward the officer, not aggressively, but with the quiet authority of someone who has finally decided to stop holding back. This body camera on your chest has recorded everything. I have neighbors who witnessed everything, and I have 16 years of expertise in exactly what happened here. You stopped me because I'm a black man in a nice neighborhood. You fabricated a report of suspicious activity to justify the stop. You attempted to escalate to a detention without any legal basis. Every single thing you did here violates the training that your own department has given you. Hartwell seemed to shrink before the camera's eye. Whatever he had thought this encounter would be, whatever power he had imagined he held, had evaporated completely. "I'd like to know your badge number and your supervisor's name," Damon said. "I intend to file a formal complaint, and I intend to request that this body camera footage be preserved as evidence." These words mark the end of the encounter itself and the beginning of its aftermath. But before we move into what happened next, I want to take a moment to reflect on what we've witnessed. This story could have ended so differently. If Damon Richardson had been someone else, someone without his training, without his knowledge, without his credentials, where might this encounter have led? If he had reacted with the anger that would have been completely justified, if he had made a sudden movement that the officer could have interpreted as threatening, if he had been alone without neighbors willing to step outside and bear witness. These are not hypothetical questions. These are the questions that millions of people live with every day. The margin between a traffic stop that ends with a warning and one that ends with handcuffs, or worse, can be terrifyingly thin. And that margin often has nothing to do with what the person being stopped has actually done. What happened on Maple Ridge Drive that Thursday afternoon became a matter of public record. Damon Richardson filed his formal complaint that same evening. By the following morning, the Westbrook Heights Police Department had retrieved and secured the body camera footage. By noon, the department's Internal Affairs Division had opened an investigation. The footage itself became a subject of intense scrutiny over the following weeks. Department officials watched it multiple times, analyzing every word, every gesture, every decision point. They saw Officer Hartwell approach a man who was doing nothing suspicious. They heard him fabricate a report of criminal activity. They watched him attempt to escalate to a detention without legal justification. And they saw the moment when his entire narrative collapsed upon discovering who he had been harassing. But it wasn't just the internal investigation that was examining this footage. Word of the incident had begun to spread through law enforcement circles almost immediately. An FBI instructor being racially profiled in his own driveway was exactly the kind of story that travels fast, whispered in break rooms and shared in private messages between officers who had trained with Damon or knew of his reputation. Within days, local media had picked up the story. A reporter from the Westbrook Heights Gazette received a tip and started making calls. Community members who had witnessed the encounter were happy to provide their perspectives. Patricia Coleman, in particular, gave an interview that was quoted extensively. "I've lived in this neighborhood since before that officer was born," she said. "I know trouble when I see it, and the only trouble on Maple Ridge Drive that day was wearing a badge." The story quickly escalated beyond local interest. National media outlets began covering it as part of a broader pattern of racial profiling incidents. Civil rights organizations issued statements. The hashtag Justice for Richardson began trending on social media, although Damon himself was reluctant to embrace his status as a symbol. "I don't want this to be about me," he said in the one interview he agreed to give during this period. "I want it to be about the countless people this happens to who don't have my training, my credentials, or my platform. I was able to stand my ground because I knew my rights and knew how to assert them safely. Not everyone has that privilege." The Westbrook Heights Police Department found itself under unprecedented public pressure. Chief Margaret Sullivan, who had led the department for the past 8 years, was forced to hold multiple press conferences addressing the incident. Her initial statements were carefully worded attempts to balance acknowledgement of the problem with protection of her officer. "We take all allegations of bias very seriously," she said at the first conference. "The incident is under investigation, and we will take appropriate action based on the findings." But as the body camera footage became public through a records request filed by the Gazette, the department's ability to manage the narrative collapsed. The footage showed exactly what Damon Richardson and the witnesses had described. There was no ambiguity, no alternative interpretation that could exonerate Officer Hartwell. He had approached a citizen who was doing nothing wrong. He had fabricated justification for the encounter. He had attempted to escalate when his authority was questioned. It was all there, recorded by his own camera, preserved in digital clarity. The investigation concluded 3 weeks after the incident. The findings were damning, but, in a sense, unsurprising given what the footage showed. Officer Kevin Hartwell had violated multiple departmental policies, including those governing the initiation of citizen contacts, the requirements for reasonable suspicion, and the prohibition on false statements. The investigation also noted his prior history of similar complaints, the pattern that had been documented but never adequately addressed. Hartwell was terminated from the Westbrook Heights Police Department on a Friday morning, exactly 26 days after he had stopped Damon Richardson on Maple Ridge Drive. His badge was collected, his service weapon secured, and his access to departmental systems revoked. He was escorted from the building by 2 officers who had been his colleagues for over a decade. But the consequences didn't end with Hartwell's termination. Chief Sullivan announced a comprehensive review of the department's bias training programs and accountability mechanisms. "We failed," she admitted at the press conference announcing the review, not just in this incident, but in our response to the warning signs that preceded it. Officer Hartwell had 3 prior complaints of biased policing. Each time we counseled him and returned him to duty. We have to ask ourselves why that was considered sufficient. The department implemented new protocols for responding to bias complaints, including mandatory reassignment pending investigation and enhanced documentation requirements for citizen contacts. They also reached out to the FBI Academy to explore partnership opportunities for improved training. Damon Richardson, somewhat ironically, was consulted in the development of these new protocols. His expertise, which Officer Hartwell had so thoroughly disregarded, became instrumental in reforming the department that had allowed such disregard to flourish. Within the community of Westbrook Heights, the incident sparked conversations that had been suppressed for years. Other residents of color came forward with their own stories of being stopped, questioned, and scrutinized in ways their white neighbors never experienced. A community forum was held at the local library, attended by over 200 people, where these experiences were shared and heard. Patricia Coleman became an unlikely advocate, speaking at the forum about what she had witnessed and what it had taught her. "I'm 82 years old," she said. "I grew up in a time when things were done differently, but that doesn't mean I can't learn. What I saw that day in the Richardsons' driveway opened my eyes to something I hadn't wanted to see. If it can happen to a man like Damon, a man I know and respect, it can happen to anyone." The forum led to the creation of a community oversight committee tasked with reviewing police practices and providing civilian input on departmental policies. It was a small step perhaps, but a meaningful one in a town that had preferred to believe such problems existed only elsewhere. As for Damon Richardson himself, he returned to his work at Quantico with a new case study to add to his curriculum. The body camera footage from his own encounter became a training tool shown to new recruits as an example of how quickly a baseless stop can escalate and how important it is to recognize and interrupt one's own biases before they lead to exactly this kind of situation. "I use my own experience now," Damon explained in a subsequent interview. "When officers in training see that this happened to an FBI instructor, someone who teaches the very courses they're taking, it drives home the point that no one is immune. Bias doesn't check credentials before it operates. It doesn't care what your job title is or how nice your neighborhood is. It just reacts to what it's been taught to see as threatening, as out of place, as suspicious." The Richardson family remained in their home on Maple Ridge Drive. They had discussed moving in the aftermath of the incident, the unwanted attention, and the painful memories making the house feel less like a sanctuary than it once had. But in the end, they decided to stay. "This is our home," Michelle Richardson said. "We bought it. We maintain it. We've raised our children here. We're not going to let one officer's prejudice drive us out of a place where we belong." Their neighbors, for the most part, rallied around them. The casseroles returned, this time as expressions of support and apology. The invitations to block parties continued, and when the Richardsons' younger son made the local soccer team that fall, the other parents cheered him on without reservation, but not everyone in the community was supportive. Some residents grumbled that the incident had been blown out of proportion, that Officer Hartwell had been doing his job, that the resulting attention had unfairly painted Westbrook Heights as a racist community. These voices were a minority, but they were there, a reminder that change comes slowly and not everyone welcomes it. Officer Kevin Hartwell, for his part, disappeared from public view after his termination. He was not charged with any crime, as the actions he had taken, while clearly violations of departmental policy, did not meet the threshold for criminal prosecution. He lost his pension eligibility, having not yet reached the required years of service, and was effectively blacklisted from law enforcement positions in the region. What became of him after that is not part of the public record. Perhaps the most significant consequence of the incident, however, was one that couldn't be measured in policy changes or personnel actions. It was the conversation that the story started, the questions it forced people to ask. Why do we accept a system where a man can be treated as suspicious for walking to his own mailbox? Why does it take credentials and cameras and witnesses to ensure accountability? Why do some people have to prove they belong in spaces they have every right to occupy? These are not comfortable questions. They don't have easy answers, but they are the questions that incidents like this one force us to confront. Here, at the end of this story, I want to leave you with something Damon Richardson said in his interview that has stayed with me since I first heard it. The body camera saved me that day, not from physical harm necessarily, but from having my word dismissed against an officer's. For decades, these encounters came down to who the system chose to believe. Now we have documentation, and documentation changes things. But we shouldn't need cameras to make officers treat people with basic dignity. The goal isn't a world where every interaction is recorded. The goal is a world where recording isn't necessary because the treatment would be the same either way. That's the world Damon Richardson trains officers to create. It's the world his encounter with Officer Hartwell showed is still far away. But every story like this one, every moment of accountability, every conversation that gets started brings us a little closer. So what do you think? Was justice served in this case? Should there have been more consequences for Officer Hartwell, or were his termination and the subsequent reforms sufficient? I genuinely want to know your thoughts. Drop a comment below and let's continue this conversation. And if this story made you think, if it made you feel something, consider subscribing to this channel. We cover stories like this regularly, stories that challenge us to see the world more clearly and to imagine how it might be better. The afternoon sun eventually set on Maple Ridge Drive that Thursday in September, the shadows lengthening until they merged into twilight. The police car had long since departed. The neighbors had returned to their homes. Damon and Michelle Richardson stood on their front porch, watching the last light fade from the sky. "You okay?" Michelle asked. Damon took a long breath. "I will be. It's just, I teach about this every day. I know the statistics, the patterns, the psychology behind it, but experiencing it yourself is different. Knowing something intellectually and feeling it are two different things." Michelle took his hand. "You handled it perfectly." "Did I?" Damon shook his head slowly. "I don't know. I kept thinking about what would have happened if I weren't who I am. If I didn't have the training, the credentials, the neighbors who came outside. There are so many ways it could have gone wrong, but it didn't. But it could have. That's the point. It shouldn't be this precarious. It shouldn't depend on having exactly the right combination of knowledge and witnesses and luck." They stood in silence for a while, watching the streetlights flicker on along Maple Ridge Drive, the neighborhood settling into its evening rhythms, families returning from work and school, the smell of dinners being prepared drifting through open windows. Normal life, continuing as it always does. "What are you going to do with it?" Michelle asked finally. Damon understood what she meant. Not the complaint, not the investigation, not the immediate aftermath. The bigger question: what would he do with this experience, this painful and illuminating gift he hadn't asked for? "I'm going to use it," he said. "Every officer I train from now on is going to hear this story. They're going to see the footage. They're going to understand, in a way they might not otherwise, that the person they stop could be anyone. That credentials and appearances don't tell you who someone is. That the only way to police fairly is to approach every person, every encounter, with the same basic respect." He paused, looking out at the street he had chosen to make his home, the community he had decided to stay and build a life in despite everything. "Maybe it won't change anything," he admitted. "Maybe I'll tell this story 100 times and officers will still make the same mistakes, let the same biases guide them. But maybe, just maybe, one of them will remember. One of them will pause before approaching someone who doesn't fit. One of them will ask themselves whether their suspicion is based on evidence or on something uglier. And if that happens, if even one encounter goes differently because of what I experienced today, then it will have been worth something. Michelle squeezed his hand. It's already worth something. You standing there, refusing to be diminished, refusing to be afraid. That mattered. It mattered to me, Damon said quietly. I hope it matters to someone else too. The next morning, Damon Richardson returned to work at the FBI Academy in Quantico. He walked into his classroom, faced a new cohort of agents in training, and began his lecture on bias recognition the way he always did, with a question. How many of you believe you're capable of treating all people equally, regardless of race, appearance, or background? Every hand in the room went up. Damon nodded. That's a good starting point. Now let me tell you a story about what happened to me yesterday, and we'll see if we can complicate that confidence a little. And the lesson began. This is the nature of change. It doesn't happen in dramatic moments, not usually. It happens in classrooms and conversations, in small decisions made differently, in the slow accumulation of awareness. It happens when people who have experienced injustice refuse to let that experience disappear into silence. It happens when communities decide that what happens to their neighbors matters, that bearing witness is a form of solidarity. What happened on Maple Ridge Drive was, in many ways, a small story. One encounter, one officer, one citizen, lasting perhaps 15 minutes on a Thursday afternoon. No one was physically harmed. No shots were fired. By the standards of police misconduct that make national headlines, it barely registers. But small stories matter. They are the threads from which the larger fabric is woven. They are the accumulation of 1,000 moments that together reveal a pattern. And they are the opportunities, each one of them, for something to change. Officer Hartwell made choices that day. He chose to stop a man who was doing nothing wrong. He chose to fabricate justification. He chose to escalate when challenged. Each choice was small in itself, but together they created an encounter that ended his career and exposed systemic failures in his department. Damon Richardson made choices too. He chose to remain calm. He chose to assert his rights. He chose to document rather than react. He chose in the end to use his experience as a teaching tool rather than letting it embitter him. And the neighbors made choices. Patricia Coleman chose to step outside. George Santos chose to stand on his porch. Others chose to watch, to witness, to be present. These choices too mattered. Every day in countless encounters across this country, similar choices are being made. The outcomes depend on who is involved, what resources they have, whether witnesses are present, whether cameras are recording. Too often, the outcomes depend on factors that should be irrelevant. The color of someone's skin, the neighborhood they're standing in, the assumptions in an officer's mind. This story ends, but the larger story continues. It continues every time someone is stopped for existing in a space where others have decided they don't belong. It continues every time an officer has to choose between bias and justice. It continues every time a community has to decide whether to look away or bear witness. I want to thank you for staying with me through this entire story. I know it was a long one, but some stories deserve the time to be told properly. If you're still here, if this story resonated with you in some way, I hope you'll consider subscribing to this channel. We tell stories like this regularly, stories that matter, stories that challenge, stories that stay with you after the video ends. And I hope, wherever you are, whatever your experience has been, that you'll carry something from Damon Richardson's story with you. Maybe it's the importance of knowing your rights. Maybe it's the value of witnesses and documentation. Maybe it's the reminder that dignity, once you decide not to surrender it, is very difficult to take. Or maybe it's simply this, that every person in every space deserves to be treated as though they belong. Because they do. They always did. The sun has set on Maple Ridge Drive. The Richardsons are in their home, going about their evening. The streetlights illuminate empty sidewalks waiting for tomorrow's foot traffic, tomorrow's encounters, tomorrow's choices. And somewhere, perhaps, an officer is watching a video of what happened that Thursday afternoon, seeing through Damon Richardson's eyes what it means to be treated as suspect in your own life. And maybe, just maybe, That officer is making a different choice about how tomorrow will go. That's all any of us can hope for, really. One choice at a time, one encounter at a time, one story at a time, until the pattern changes.